Environmental Sensing Activity Hub within the Department of Geography. Welcome, Dr. Tebbs.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that. So I'm Dr. Emma Tebbs from King's College London, and my research is focused on using satellite Earth observation to study environmental change with a particular focus on water resources. So today I'm going to start by giving you an overview of Earth observation and its applications for sustainable water resources management. And then I'm going to go through a few case study examples. So the first one is a project that I did recently on looking at satellite soil moisture and its application in both the UK and India. And the second one will be some work that I've done on Lake Turkana in Kenya, and looking at how we can use remote sensing and satellite data to investigate the impact of dam developments on inland waters. And then finally, looking at floating macrophytes, so invasive plants in aquatic ecosystems, how we can use satellite data to look at the dynamics of these plants over time. Okay, so what do I mean by Earth observation? So this is all about gathering information about the Earth's surface from a distance, and typically using remote sensing technologies, mainly satellites. So I'm primarily going to be talking about satellite remote sensing. And so we use electromagnetic radiation that's emitted from the Earth's surface, often in visible region, but also thermal radiation and microwave radiation, and that gives us information about the Earth's surface. So yeah, in the case of water bodies, we have light from the sun that will interact with the water body, and depending on the materials present in that water, that will change the spectrum of that light. So the satellite detects that reflected light and measures the spectrum or color of that. And so that can tell us about, we can use that to map the area of surface water, and also to find out about materials present such as phytoplankton and suspended sediment. And then there are two main types of sensors that we can use. So we can either use passive sensors, and these are sensors that use natural sources of radiation. So for example, light from the sun that's been reflected from the Earth's surface, or thermal radiation that's emitted from the Earth. And then we also have active sensors, and these produce their own source of electromagnetic radiation, and then measure what's reflected back towards the sensor. Okay, so how is Earth observation suited to assessing the sustainability of water resources? So it can be more cost effective than ground-based surveys. It allows us to look at larger spatial scales, so we can look at regional and even global scale coverage, and they can provide consistent long-term data sets. So often with in situ monitoring, you might have a short-term study, or you might have studies that are using slightly different sensors and methods. But the nice thing about satellite data is that it gives you consistent long-term measurements. So we now have data going back to the 1970s. So that therefore allows you to assess both the current conditions and the status of those water resources, but also looking at long-term trends and change. And then we can start to investigate what are the drivers of those changes and what the impacts of that change might be on human well-being. And we can also then use that to assess the impact of management interventions. So we can look at how the system changes before and after particular interventions are introduced. Some of the limitations of Earth observation. So we often also need to validate the results with field data. So we still need to go on the ground and collect some data for validation. And satellites can't measure everything. So we often need to combine that with other data sets to give us a holistic understanding of the system. There are also trade-offs in different sensors. So, for example, the Landsat sensor that has a 16-day revisit frequency. So it collects imagery over the same point every 16 days and a 30-meter spatial resolution. There are now newer sensors like Sentinel-2 that have improved frequency. So we can look between every 3 to 5 days, and we've got 10-meter resolution. And so this is a European Space Agency, a recent satellite. And then there are other satellites that have a coarser spatial resolution. So, for example, MODIS has between 250 meters and 1 kilometer, but very frequent imagery. So depending on what we're interested in, that will determine what sensor we use. And so I'm now going to give you an overview of some of the products that are available and the types of things that we can measure with remote sensing. So first of all, we can look at climate variability. So things like rainfall, temperature, and evaporation. We can get that from satellite data. And this is important because these control the amount of fresh water that's available in the landscape and drives change in those freshwater resources. We can also then measure the extent of those surface waters. So there's a recent product that's mapped globally, all surface waters, and allows you to look at how those change over time. And we can measure the water levels as well. So in large lakes and rivers, we can measure how the water level changes over time using radar altimetry. So these are sensors that produce microwave radiation, and they send a pulse of microwaves to the surface and measure how long that takes to come back. And that tells us about the height of those water bodies. And so combining that with surface water data, we can also get an idea of the volume of water and how that's changing. Another important store of water is soil moisture. So there are recent sensors that use microwave radiation to monitor soil moisture, and I'll say a bit more about that later on. And even groundwater, there are sensors that use changes in the Earth's gravitational field to get an idea of groundwater availability. Then within the catchment, we can start to look at things like land cover change and how the properties of that catchment might impact on those water bodies. So things like vegetation cover, agricultural land, and urban areas. So you can start to look at what change in the catchment might be driving changes in those water bodies. And then finally, we can also look at water quality. So we can look at things like chlorophyll concentration, turbidity, and suspended sediment. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an overview of some of the things we can do with Earth observation. So I'm now going to talk through a few case studies. So the first one, this is a project that I was involved with that was funded by the India UK Water Centre. And the project was looking at satellite soil moisture observations and the applications for those in both the UK and India. So soil moisture is a really important variable which controls the partitioning of water and energy at the Earth's surface. And so it's important in processes like evaporation, groundwater recharge, and runoff generation. And so over the last decade, there's been an increase in the number and accuracy of Earth observation-based soil moisture products. So new microwave sensors such as SMOS and SMAP. And so this project aimed to review both the current and also potential future applications of satellite soil moisture data in the UK and India, and also to identify barriers to use of that data and potential opportunities and user needs for incorporating that data into monitoring and forecasting. And thirdly, we were also looking at what in situ sensors were needed to validate those products. And so the methods that we used was a literature survey, and also a user survey, and then a pilot demonstration of some low-cost sensors. And so what we found was that there's a huge range of potential applications of this satellite soil moisture data. So some of the main ones that were identified through the literature review were use in weather and climate forecasting, flood prediction, drought monitoring, and agricultural services, so things like irrigation management. And then some of the key findings from this study. So we found that new products such as the ESA Climate Change Initiative soil moisture product, they combine data from various sensors to produce data that overcomes some of the limitations of individual sensors and to produce long-term data sets. And so these products have huge potential for improving monitoring and forecasting in both India and the UK. So in the UK, soil moisture is already incorporated into two operational numerical weather prediction models. And there's currently an ongoing India-UK collaboration that's exploring the use of satellite soil moisture for improving predictions of the monsoon. Soil moisture data also has potential for improving monitoring of water-related hazards such as droughts, particularly in India, and also flood forecasting. And then potential agricultural applications include use for things like predicting crop yields and also irrigation monitoring. And so there are opportunities to incorporate these products into commercial agricultural services and also for supporting government decision making. Okay, so some of the barriers that we found then was the availability of ground data for validating these products. Also, the spatial resolution of these products is quite coarse, so that limited applications for some things like irrigation would ideally have higher resolution products. And then there was issues around a lack of awareness of how to access and use the data. In terms of in situ sensors, we found that in the UK, there's a network of cosmic ray soil moisture sensors that can be used to provide in situ observations for validation. And also the Cosmos India project is improving the availability of in situ soil moisture data in India. So for anyone who's interested to find out more about this work, there's a state of the science brief that can be found on the India UK Water Centre website. Okay, so the second case study that I'm going to talk to you about is Lake Turkana. And so this is a lake in northern Kenya. And so what we were interested in is seeing how we can use Earth observation to investigate the threats to this lake, particularly threats from dams. So this is a lake that's important for its unique biological and cultural diversity, and it supports around 300,000 Kenyans that depend on the lake for their livelihoods, including fishing. So the lake's threatened by the Gibby III Dam, which has been built on the Omo River in Ethiopia. And the dam will provide hydroelectric power to Ethiopia and surrounding countries, but it will also permanently alter the hydrological cycle of Lake Turkana. So the Omo River provides 80% of the inflow into Lake Turkana. And so, changes in the hydrology of that river will have a profound impact on the lake. And so using satellite radar altimetry, so this graph shows the long-term changes in the lake level in Lake Turkana. And what this shows is that since the reservoir began operations and began filling, that's caused a 2-meter decline in lake levels due to the filling of the reservoir, and it's also caused a loss of the seasonal oscillations. So that's really significant because the ecosystem is adapted to those seasonal fluctuations in hydrological inputs. And so what the aim of our study was to use remote sensing to investigate the impact of these dam-related hydrological changes on the lake. So to do this, we wanted to investigate the relationship between river discharge and chlorophyll as an indication of phytoplankton concentrations in Lake Turkana, and then develop a model that we can then use to predict the impact of changes in environmental flows on the chlorophyll dynamics in the lake. Okay, so to do this, we used a European Space Agency Diversity 2 inland water products. And these are based on the MERIS satellite sensor. They have a 300-meter spatial resolution, and monthly data is available between 2002 and 2012. And there are 14 different water parameters available, including chlorophyll A, total suspended matter, and turbidity. And if for anyone who's interested, these products are available for over 300 lakes globally. Okay, so what we found from analysing this data set was that there's a very high concentrations of chlorophyll at the north end of the lake. And this is where the Omo River enters, and it brings in nutrients that support these phytoplankton blooms. And these are very important for supporting the fisheries. So the fisheries feed on this phytoplankton. And we also found that there was a strong seasonal cycle in chlorophyll in the lake. So there was an annual peak in chlorophyll, and this coincided with the flooding of the Omo River. We then linked this to information on Omo River discharge. And we found that there's also this kind of annual peak in river inflows. And so we developed a model to look at the relationship between the two. Okay, so you can see here the relationship between chlorophyll and river inflows. And we found that there was a relatively good linear relationship between them. And so we could then use that to develop a model for predicting how chlorophyll might change in the lake in future, given different future discharge scenarios. Okay, so the figure on the right shows these predictions. So the black line is the kind of seasonal pattern of chlorophyll based on prior to the dam conditions. And then the red line shows the seasonal pattern after the dam. And so what you can see is there's a dampening of that seasonal cycle. And we also looked at the impact of irrigation abstractions. So there are plans to develop commercial agriculture that will use large volumes of water from the Omo River. So we also looked at the impact of that and found that that would cause a reduction in chlorophyll. So both the dam and these potential irrigation abstractions will have a profound impact on the phytoplankton concentrations in the lake, and therefore also on the fisheries which local communities depend on. Okay, so the last case study that I wanted to talk to you about is using satellite Earth observation to look at invasive aquatic plants, particularly water hyacinth. So water hyacinth is originally from South America, and it's invaded many tropical aquatic ecosystems globally. It causes all sorts of problems in inland waters by blocking waterways. It provides a habitat for disease vectors such as mosquitoes, and it leads to deoxygenation and general poor water quality. So that can impact on human well-being and also affect livelihoods like tourism and fisheries. So the image on the top right here was taken in Kerala backwaters. So we few years ago we ran a field trip with our undergraduates to Kerala, and so I took this image there showing the channel completely blocked by water hyacinth. And so the idea of this study is that we want to use satellite data to allow us to monitor the spread of this invasive plant and investigate the dynamics over time. And so we're developing methods for mapping water hyacinth using new satellite sensors, including both Sentinel-1, which is a radar satellite, and Sentinel-2, which is optical satellite. And so these images at the bottom show so that we have Lake Okeechobee in Florida. So this is one of our key case study areas. And so you can see we've distinguished floating in weeds from other macrophytes. And so this is primarily water hyacinth and also water lettuce. And then this satellite image on the right shows Bernard Lake in Kerala. And so you can see the bright green areas are where we have water hyacinth. So yeah, so this work's ongoing, but we're developing products with both radar and optical. The advantage of radar is that it can see through clouds, so you can get more consistent imagery. And we're also using a cloud-based computing platform called Google Earth Engine. So I just wanted to briefly mention this. So it's a platform that allows you to process large volumes of satellite data and access lots of archives from NASA and European Space Agency and other sensors and process them in the cloud, so you don't have to download that imagery, and it just speeds up the process and allows you to look at long time series of data as well. And so in the example here, this is a radar satellite image of Lake Okeechobee in Florida, and the different colors in the image represent different vegetation types. So the dark areas are water, and the lighter colors are where we've got different types of vegetation. And so we can then convert this into maps looking at change in vegetation cover. And where we have a change in consecutive images, this is likely due to where we have these floating weeds. So yeah, so the next step is we want to look at creating time series of long-term trends in floating weeds. Okay, so that brings me to the end. So just to conclude, hopefully I've demonstrated how we can use Earth observation data to provide information on both water quantity and quality, and also looking at the seasonality of those as well. And then bringing in other data sets to then look at the drivers and impacts of those changes. So looking at things like climate, land cover, and macrophytes. We can use this information for assessing the status and trends of water bodies, for modeling processes and relationships, and also for projecting into the future. So like in the case of Lake Turkana, we were able to predict what the impacts of those dam developments might be. And then for also assessing the impact of management interventions. So with the water hyacinth products, what we plan to do is produce something that's a useful resource for managers who want to assess how effective their treatment of water hyacinth is. And then a final point is that this is also provides a useful independent source of information. So particularly for transboundary management of water resources, it can provide a useful independent source of information. So that's the end, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much for listening. Any questions?
In fact, there are a lot of questions to pray, but probably time is a constraint. There are questions probably you can see. So I don't know, Dr. Dhanya. Is there any time we can consider for a couple of questions probably?
Sir, could you take a few questions? I can see a lot of relevant questions are there.
Right. So
Go ahead and
maybe a couple of them. Yeah.
yeah.
Dr. Shandarajan is asking, please explain about spatial and temporal resolution of remotely sensed soil moisture data availability. Spatial
Okay.
and temporal resolution, which you indicate a little bit, but maybe repeat.
Yeah. So there are currently limitations with the spatial resolution. So a lot of sensors like SMOS and SMAP have very coarse resolution. So I can't remember exactly, but I think it's of the order of kilometers. So obviously if you're looking at regional drought or flood prediction applications, that might be sufficient. But if you're interested in irrigation management, then you really need finer scale data. So there are sensors like Sentinel-1 radar sensor, which has just been started to be used for soil moisture applications, and that has a 10-meter spatial resolution. So yeah, there are some higher resolution products becoming available, and also there are various methods for downscaling. So they will combine the coarser resolution data sets like SMOS and SMAP with high resolution sensors like Landsat to downscale that to provide high resolution data. Yeah, and typically in terms of temporal resolution, I think we're talking kind of monthly. So Sentinel-1 is available every 12 days. But yeah, it's kind of weeks to months.
Yeah, there is another question. Can we calculate the volume of water, the cloud and size of the cloud and area in which cloud will pour water on the ground? This is more of a climate prediction probably. So if you would like to answer
Yeah.
that question. Yeah.
So there are products that use that uses thermal imagery to measure clouds and looks at the temperature of the cloud to estimate which clouds are most likely to produce precipitation. And so from that, it estimates and predicts rainfall. Hopefully that helps answer that.
Yeah, there are actually lots of questions, but I'm afraid whether there is next speaker waiting. So, Dr. Manisha, should we proceed with few more questions or we'll wait for the next speaker? If Dr. Emma, if you have a little bit of time, if you can go through the questions and whatever relevant question you feel, if you can briefly type the answers, then we can save some time. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
Dr. Dhanya, are you around? Soumya, if you please introduce if Dr. Dhanya is not around.